welcome to this podcast, My Positive Birth, a little corner of the internet where I will be collecting positive stories from women birthing their babies across the UK. My name is Lisa. I'm a doula in southwest London. I have 3 children and 2 positive birth stories. I truly believe that we can all learn so much by listening to the positive stories of women and families who have gone before us. What their birth experience was like, what they did, how they felt, how they feel now a few months or even years later. So come and surround yourself with positive birth stories, told in women's own words. And I hope you'll find a village here to calm you, but also to inspire you and give you confidence in birth. All women and babies deserve a positive birth experience. So let's get cracking on today's episode. Hello, it's Lisa here, and I thought I'd start the podcast off telling my own positive birth story. Usually I'll be interviewing other people, but I do have 2 positive birth stories to tell, and I'd love to tell you about my first one today. To understand this story, I think it is important to know a little bit about my first birth. So I was pregnant back in 2012. Mercifully smooth conception, really pretty healthy and smooth pregnancy. I had quite a lot of sickness in the beginning, but absolutely nothing compared to some women. I was working. I had 2 friends who were pregnant at the same time, so that was really exciting. Things were generally going well. Over the course of the pregnancy, I'd known absolutely nothing about birth prior to this pregnancy. So I'd started to get interested in it, and really my mentality is to that date was one of which, I try hard at something and it will go well. So I will try hard at understanding birth and preparing for birth, and then everything will be fine. I don't think I would have told you that was my background narrative, but that's very much the way I approached things. I went to antenatal classes, but they didn't talk a whole lot about the process of birth. I did buy a book on, it was called Natural Childbirth, The Bradley Way. And actually now looking back on it, parts of that book are really, really quite wacky. And they have a very sort of coached approach to the pushing stage of labour, which has just ended up being so different from my own experiences. But there was a really good description of how the baby sort of comes out. And as I read that, and as I looked into birth in the UK and what I might encounter in hospital, I started to think, I think I'd really like to have my baby at home. And so we booked with the home birth team for our local area, and I got more and more into that idea. I got to about 34 weeks pregnant, and there'd been glucose in my urine at a couple of my appointments. So the home birth midwife said, probably means nothing at all, but let's just get you a glucose tolerance test, that's what it's called at the hospital, just to see if anything's going on. I went to that test. I literally had absolutely no thoughts in my head that I would come back as having any sort of illness. It just wasn't even a thing. And that reveals my privilege of my mercifully really healthy life to date. I just felt so well. But I was absolutely astounded when that test did come back positive, and I was diagnosed with gestational diabetes. And things from there on in that pregnancy were a bit of a whirlwind for me. So I remember being really surprised about it to start with. I then suddenly was on this completely different pathway regarding my birth when I was planned. I don't remember the details, but to me it felt like I was just kicked off the home birth team. I don't remember a conversation or a dialogue. Perhaps that's being unfair, but that's sort of my memory of it. I was having an appointment with a diabetes midwife. She was saying, oh, we're going to want to induce you soon. I was probably about 36 weeks by this stage. And, I said, oh, well, I don't really want that. So she said, right, well, we'll book you in with the consultant. So I thought, fine, I'll go and see the consultant. I had an absolutely, unfortunately, catastrophic appointment with that consultant where she put me under a lot of pressure to accept an induction. I can't actually remember if the induction would have been at 39 weeks or at 40 weeks, but neither of which were what I wanted. I'd always felt that I was going to go very overdue. I don't really like that term, but very much beyond my due date. I remember my mum talking to us about that, our whole lives, that me and my brother had come 2 weeks after our due dates. I just felt like my baby had a lot more growing to do. So I asked the consultant to provide me the evidence that she was using to give me this recommendation to be induced. And she gave me the result of 2 studies, and I went home and looked them up, and both of the studies were just talking about the parameters by which we should diagnose women with gestational diabetes. And actually I realise now, my timing was difficult because there'd just been a big study and they decided to massively change the boundaries for when you would be diagnosed with gestational diabetes. And prior to that, perhaps I wouldn't have been. But anyway, I was. But the research that the consultant provided didn't provide me with any sort of understanding of why I should be induced before my baby was ready. And I remember saying to her, this is all very stressful. I know I can talk about it calmly now, but it was very stressful at the time. And I remember writing a letter to her about 4:00 in the morning. And I said, you say you're worried about my baby getting stuck, but induction also carries an increased risk of that, which is called shoulder dystocia. And it's thankfully rare in all cases. It's a small risk. But I said, you are prioritizing one risk over another. Basically, I feel like it comes down to a judgment call. And you've made your judgment call that I should be induced, but I am free to make mine, and I would rather wait for my baby to arrive. I should say that I had been easily able to control my diet. So my blood sugars were in the normal range very quickly, but obviously I was diagnosed a bit later on, so I don't know how they'd been for the rest of the pregnancy. Anyway, as this is not actually the birth story I'm meant to be talking about, long story short, I changed hospitals. I was so upset by that appointment. Changed hospitals at 37 weeks pregnant. I met with the senior midwife at the new hospital, and we came up with a plan that I would use the birth centre up to 42 weeks pregnant, which was actually slightly beyond when anyone was allowed to use the birth centre. And then really difficult for me at the time, I hadn't gone into labour by 42 weeks. I was extremely stressed by that point, but I hadn't gone into labour, and so I did agree to an induction. And for me, that wasn't a positive experience. Now, my mindset going into it was very resigned, and yes, so how much that contributed to it, I don't know. But my birth ended up, I ended up needing pessary and then had my waters broken. Then I went on a hormone drip. And eventually my son was born with the help of forceps. And I had quite a lot of blood loss afterwards, and also a 3rd-degree tear, which is a more severe tear that needs to be repaired in surgery. So we had a rocky road, and it was a rocky first year, of which I'm sure the birth contributed to, but I think also my personality being what it is, I just found the transition to motherhood really tough as well, and kind of so much needing to release and surrender and be in the moment, and hard to plan and control. All this goes really against my own personality. So it was a hard first year for me. So that was my first birth. That's the context to this story. So me and my husband started talking about having another baby. My husband's about 13 years older than me. So we thought, if we want to have another baby, we don't want to have a big gap between them. But at the same time, this year has been the hardest year of my life. And how can I look after another baby? So my husband said, as he was doing consultancy work at the time, should we look into him taking 6 months off if we were to have another baby? So that was amazing to me. And that was really all I needed to encourage me that it would be a good idea to have another baby. We were really blessed. We conceived her really quickly. So there's just less than 2 years between them. So really, pretty soon after I started to feel myself again, well, my new self. I very much believe that motherhood is a fundamental transition. So I'm not who I was before, but I started to feel well, and pretty soon I was pregnant again. Now this time I had a bit of a list. If you think from my previous story. So I had the gestational diabetes to think about. I had the postpartum haemorrhage to think about. I had the 3rd degree tear to think about. These are all things that would put me into a higher risk category according to the NHS. And I also had the fact that I hadn't actually gone into labour by 42 weeks. And part of my frustration with that was I pretty much knew when I conceived, because my husband was travelling for work. So, I knew when I'd conceived. And when I went for my 12-week scan, my due date was moved forward by 5 days. And I remember saying to them at the time, I think that's probably not right. And them saying, oh, it won't make any difference whatsoever. Well, then when I got to the end of my pregnancy, every day felt so loaded within the system that, I was getting closer to some sort of tipping point where, as Sarah Wickham, who's an amazing lady in the birth world, but, my baby felt like my baby was going to turn into a pumpkin. So I had all these things to think about this second time around. And, probably representative of me being me, I put a lot of thought into it. And, this approach would not be the right one for some people, but this is who I am. So the first thing that I'd done, even before we'd conceived, was I'd started tracking my ovulation, because I wanted to be 100% clear on when this baby was conceived, because I wanted to be really confident of my due date. So I knew when I'd ovulated, the month that I fell pregnant with my daughter Elsa. And then I decided that I would have an early scan in the hospital. And hopefully the due date they gave me from that would be close to the one that I thought was correct. And then I wouldn't go for the 12-week scan, which was when they'd previously changed my dates so much. For me, I decided that I wasn't going to have the screening for genetic disorders at 12 weeks. So that wasn't a factor for me, that I decided not to have that scan. So I went for a scan at about 8 or 9 weeks. They did give me a due date, which I felt was, fairly compatible with my ovulation tests. So due date tick, I felt like I at least had a reasonable due date in my notes. I also decided not to have any gestational diabetes testing done via the hospital. They would, at that point in time, I'm not sure if they still do, but they would have sent me for another glucose tolerance test. But whether I'd wanted to be tested or not, or gone under the hospital for gestational diabetes, I never saw the point in having that test because I already had a way of monitoring my blood sugars at home, which was all set up in my first pregnancy. So I thought, well, I'll just do that myself, which is all that the result of a positive glucose tolerance test would tell me anyway. So I started to monitor my blood sugars at home. My blood sugars certainly would have been outside of the NHS ranges if I hadn't very carefully chosen my diet during my pregnancy. I felt at the time, I think there's still a growing body of thought as to how normal insulin resistance is in pregnancy and whether, I had a pathology, whether I had an illness or whether my body was just responding to pregnancy as some women do. But anyway, regardless of that, I wanted to be absolutely sure this time that my baby wouldn't be having excess glucose during the pregnancy, and therefore I could be really confident that my body wasn't going to make a baby that wasn't going to fit out of my pelvis. So I monitored my own blood sugars, and I did, I needed to keep my diet very tight to keep within the ranges, but I did, and I broadly did that for my whole pregnancy. So that was sort of the gestational diabetes tick. The postpartum haemorrhage, I had always felt that was all caused by the quite serious tear that I had. There was no documentation relating to that, so it was just recorded as a hemorrhage, which can be bleeding from the site of the placenta as well. But in my mind, I felt comfortable that was from the tear, and therefore if I didn't tear like that again, I wouldn't need to worry too much about blood loss. So I declined an appointment with the consultant for that. And the tear itself, mercifully, always felt it had been healed really well, and that my physical recovery from the birth had, considering what I'd been through, had been really good. So again, I can't remember if that would have been the same probably would have been the same consultant appointment to discuss that as the hemorrhage one. So either way, those I declined, and I decided this time that I wanted to have a home birth. I felt I'd kind of, I'd done it reluctantly, really, the kind of systems way, particularly with the label that I had as a high-risk woman, even though I didn't feel high risk, and my gestational diabetes was completely controlled by the end of the pregnancy. But, this time I really didn't feel like a high-risk woman. I knew my blood sugars were normal for the whole of the pregnancy. So I decided I wanted a home birth, and I remember ringing up the hospital to book this in, and I think that phone call was a little bit difficult. I feel like somebody said something, I don't know if my gestational diabetes came up or something, and somebody said something to me along the lines of, I'm not sure you're going to be allowed, and that was a bit of a trigger for me, and I felt just this visceral wobbliness, and that was the only time I really felt that with a health professional in that pregnancy, although it will become clear why as I tell my story, because I actually then got amazing support. But I remember thinking, there's stuff buried here when I had that reaction that I'd sort of probably rather not revisit at this point in time anyway. So anyway, that the result of that phone call, even though it was a bit tricky, was that I would have this appointment with the home birth midwife, and she's a lady called Maria. I remember Maria coming to my house when I was, I think, just over 20 weeks pregnant. This was in 2014 that my daughter was born. I remember it so clearly, still makes me emotional thinking about it. So Maria arrived, and my husband, Tim, who had been an amazing advocate for me the whole time and was really on board with everything I said, and that was really important to me. Mothers want to make good choices for their babies, and all the time, that was all I wanted all the time. Like, And I felt in my first pregnancy, people were suggesting that I didn't want to keep my baby safe, but I knew that I was the one who wanted to keep my baby safe more than anything. So Tim was brilliant, but as Maria arrived, he said, I've just got to take this phone call for work. I'll just be 5 minutes and then I'll come to help you. So I thought, okay, that's fine. And Maria came in. She sat down. She said, I hear that you're interested in booking a home birth. And I said to her, I know I want a home birth. I've got these things, X, Y, Z, which might mean that it goes against your guidelines. But I've thought these things through, just like I explained to you guys on the podcast. And I still want a home birth. And she said to me, I can tell you've thought it all through. That sounds brilliant. I'd love to support you. And it literally, honestly, I want to cry, but that's not very conducive to recording. It took less than 5 minutes, less than the duration of Tim's phone call. And he came in. I was in absolute floods of tears. And he probably thought, what has Maria said to her? I couldn't even tell him that I was just crying because I was just so relieved that somebody had listened to me and somebody was prepared to support me, and also she didn't think that I was mad. She could see that I wanted the best for my baby, and I believed that planning this birth this way was that. So that was amazing, and Maria did all my appointments from then on at home, which was lovely too. I remember Maria saying to me at that appointment, she said, great, we've got you booked in. What we need to work on is your confidence, because I think the experience last time has taken a lot from you. And I didn't even really resonate with that at the time. I just thought, now, great, I've got my home birth booked in. I'm sure it'll be fine. That's all I needed. I didn't really think about my confidence. So the pregnancy went on beautifully, uneventfully. Maria came for every appointment. I just carried on monitoring my blood sugars. I did find that a bit of a drain because it felt like a bit of a test, and I had to test. I didn't have to, but I was testing my blood sugars 4 times a day. But they were fine. Maria felt the baby was fine. I felt the baby was fine, which she would say is far more important. I got to my due date, had absolutely no expectation that the baby would have arrived by then. Just again, felt very, very clear that my babies would like to take a little bit longer to appear in the world. In fact, I think I had my baby shower planned for a couple of days after my due date. That's how confident I was that there would be no baby by then. And I was right. And I was fine. I got to about 41 weeks and I was fine. And then every day then felt like it started to feel quite long. And I really started to lose confidence. I was low on confidence. And I just started to think, maybe my body can't go into labour, or maybe my body keeps hold of its babies too long, or maybe I will need to be induced again. And I remember it must have been Sunday evening, and I started to get very sort of mild cramps. And I think I had a bit of a show when I went to the bathroom. I think I wondered if my waters had gone very gently, but I didn't really want to think about it. But these cramps, I started to get a bit excited, and I stayed up all night, I think. But very, very mild, very stop-start. Nothing with any sort of pattern or any sort of intensity that was actually physically challenging me at all. Just mentally, I was at the end of my rope. is this, I think at that point I just don't even know what I was thinking, but I think I still wasn't thinking I was in labour, because I remember Maria coming the next morning for a routine appointment. And I remember saying to her, "Oh, Maria, do you think I should go for a sweep?" Which was something that I hadn't particularly planned to have in this pregnancy. Do you think I should be induced? Should I be having extra monitoring? And I think, Maria was looking at me and thinking, I'm pretty sure you're in labour, Lisa. But she was really kind. I remember her just giving me some date. She was like, I think it was Monday by now, and she was like, okay, let's say on Thursday. If nothing's happened, you'll go to the hospital. And Maria knew full well that there would be a baby by Thursday. So I was still getting these cramps, and I was so restless mentally and physically. I was just so restless. So I was like, okay, well, I think this is it. This is labour. I had a few friends who'd had second babies by this point in time. And I thought, great, they had just started contractions and they just ramped up. And then within a few hours, they'd had a baby. So if that's what, if I'm in labour, that's what will happen to me. And I remember shipping my little son, who was just less than 2, off to his grandparents, which is where he was going to go. It was this time of year that I'm recording this podcast now, in June, because Wimbledon tennis was on, and I live in Wimbledon. And I remember spending that day bouncing on my ball, walking up and down the stairs, watching the tennis, restless, not really counting or thinking about anything, just thinking about the fact that what was this, because it wasn't really going anywhere. And then I remember asking my husband to bring my son back. And I remember being embarrassed. It just seems ridiculous now, but I just remember thinking, this is so embarrassing. Like, I've told everyone that I'm in labour and nothing really is happening, and I don't have a baby, and now I've got to tell them that actually I'm not in labour and my son can come home. So he came back. I remember my husband putting him to bed. I was just all over the place. I remember making myself some cheese on toast and eating that. So that was probably about 7:30 in the evening. I think if I got up and walked around, I would feel these cramps, but if I lay down, they would just go away altogether. So it got to about 9:30, and I was exhausted by this point in time. I just had a whole day of just pacing around, basically watching my body, waiting for something to happen. So me and Tim, my husband, we decided that we would set up a bed for me downstairs, and that was what I wanted. He didn't kick me out of our bedroom. We'd set up a bed for me downstairs so I could just be restless, and hopefully he would get some sleep. And he texted Maria, we've still got the text, at about 9:30. He said, things have died down, we'll try and get some sleep. So she said, okay, that's great, everything's fine. So I did sleep for a couple of hours because I was absolutely exhausted. And then just before 11 p.m, long, really intense contractions started to wake me up. I remember being so exhausted that I slept between them, and they were, according to the actual birth book that I'd read, they were really quite far apart. I'd never timed anything, but they were long enough apart that I could have a little sleep between them. But then they started to get a bit closer together, and I put the TENS machine on. And then I woke Tim up. This must have all happened quite quickly. So I woke Tim up at some point, and I said, oh, can you fill up the pool? It does feel like things have maybe moved on a bit. I still wasn't really convinced that I was in labour. I just thought, I don't think I can do this. So this probably isn't labour. The other thing that was really important to me was, in my first birth, there'd come a point where I'd gone up onto the ward and they'd started me on the oxytocin drip, and the consultant had said to me, do you want to have an epidural at the same time as you have this drip? and because contractions on the drip can feel quite different to ones that the body initiates. And I was like, no, I don't want an epidural. I didn't want any of it. Like, how could I agree to anything? But once I had contractions stimulated by the drip, they were absolute agony to me. And there was a very clear point to me in my labour where I broke mentally. And I was suffering so much, and I was just screaming like a wounded animal. And, that's very personal to me and not the experience of everybody. But I just had this memory from my first labour of that mental breaking point, and I felt like I never got back from that point. And so in this labour, I was just so determined not to break mentally. So I just kept telling myself, you've got ages to go. This might not even be labour. Just keep going. And then, so Tim was filling the pool, which I believe didn't go very well because there was some sort of issue with the hose. That he was very distracted. Suddenly, my body decided to show me that it really did know how to contract. And I think it was about 45 minutes, but this is only piecing it together from, thinking about it afterwards. I think I had about 45 minutes of just pretty intense contractions with very little break. And I didn't know what to do with myself. But equally, it felt very much within me. It never occurred to me that this was the time that I should call a midwife. It never occurred to me. I had my TENS machine on, and I remember really appreciating that. And the boost button was sort of a permanent trigger. I remember I must have had my phone right next to me, and I accidentally called one of my best friends and left her a voicemail of whilst I was contracting. And to this day, she assures me that she did not listen to it, but she might just be being very kind. So I wasn't like, I was still around, and I was able to notice that and hang up and think. I didn't really think much about it at the time. I was busy, but I wasn't suffering. I was just in the moment, I think, and still I think telling myself, you could have ages to go. I also did start thinking during that very intense period, what am I doing, and can I actually do this at home, and do I need an epidural, and has this been a good idea? And then somehow I decided that I needed to get in that pool, and the pool was upstairs, I was downstairs, and I remember I felt a bit like a hippo searching for water. And in my memory, but sadly there's no one around to confirm or deny this, I feel like I sort of strayed up the stairs, stripping off the very little I had on anyway. As I went up, I must have ripped off the TENS machine, and I was like a hippo. I was getting in that water. I think Tim wanted to tell me that it still wasn't quite full up, or it wasn't quite the right temperature, but I had no interest in anything he had to say. And I was in, and that was great. That felt really good to get in the water. And then I wasn't in there very long at all, and I don't know, maybe I had one or two contractions. And then suddenly, and that this makes me quite emotional as well. Suddenly I had this contraction, and I had no idea what was happening to me, but I just felt like my body was vomiting in reverse. It was the most powerful, incredible feeling that I have ever felt in my life. And, the physicality of my body at that point in time, it's just something that to this day astounds me. And I thought, well, I think my body is birthing this baby. I was absolutely mentally astounded and didn't really believe it. And Tim rang Maria. He'd perhaps rung her a few minutes earlier, actually, and said that I was in the pool. So she said, okay, I'm on my way. But the second one of these boofy, amazing contractions. And I was like, oh, I think I can feel the baby's head. We didn't know if it was a boy or girl at this point in time. So he rang Maria back, and Maria was like, oh, I'm not going to make it. You've only rung me like 2 minutes ago. So she said, call an ambulance. Tim is very much the kind of person who would want to do that at that point in time. I didn't care less what anyone was doing. I didn't feel scared. I don't remember feeling scared. I just remember being just totally in the moment. And I was shocked, but at the same time, those contractions, I just had absolutely no doubt that my baby was going to be born. And, when I think of myself lying on my back with those forceps in my first birth, and I think, if we were worried about that baby getting stuck, not harnessing the power of these contractions just seems ridiculous. This, if I could have harnessed that in my first birth, then I am in no doubt that would have given my baby his best chance of being birthed. I wasn't thinking like that at the moment. I was just thinking, I think I'm going to have another baby. And being sort of in awe and sort of in fear of those contractions at the same time, because they were so powerful. So I had another one, and her head was birthed. And I remember putting my hand down. This is another just tearful moment. Putting my hand down and feeling my baby's head. And I felt her head spin in my hands. And this was something that I'd read about in this birth book about childbirth, and I'd also read in that book, that this is something that maybe doctors don't often see because they don't see undisturbed physiological birth. So I felt her head spin when she was still in, her body was still inside me, and I remember just thinking, this is incredible. And then one more enormous contraction, and she was born. Tim was like doing his own thing on the phone. So I remember that I sort of heard the operator answer, and I heard him say, woman in labour, head emerging. And I've always teased him about that afterwards, at this sort of momentous moment in our lives of his daughter being born. It wasn't like, oh, my wife's having our baby. But he said that he very much feels that was the most accurate way to get the information across, and accuracy and speed was what was needed at that moment. So Tim was on the phone to a lady called Lucy, and, they were fine. She was asking him questions. I was just in my own world. And I just picked my baby up and seemed completely normal. And we just sat there staring at each other for a little while. I was still in the water, obviously. She was on my chest. She didn't cry. I remember she had one eye open and she was sort of looking around. She looked pink. She looked great. I wasn't worried about her at any point in time. And then she let out a little cry, which satisfied Lucy on the other end of the phone. And we just rested for a minute. We didn't get a huge amount of time doing that because the ambulance people arrived very quickly, and they wanted me to get out of they wanted to cut the cord. And when Caleb was born, my son, my first birth, I've been very annoyed because they said he had meconium in his waters, which I was never sure about, and I thought was probably because he was 42 weeks-ish. In my memory, they'd pretty much cut the cord straight away, even though he looked completely healthy and he was absolutely screaming his head off. They cut the cord in order for the doctors to look at him, and I regret. I don't have actually many regrets from my first birth at all. I just felt like it was what it was, and I did the best I could within the system I was in. But that had annoyed me, that they'd cut his cord. And so I didn't want that to happen this time around. So I said, no, I don't want you to cut my cord. And he said, okay, then you'll have to get out the pool. So I was like, fine, I'll get out the pool. And then Maria came not long afterwards. And a little bit, unfortunately, Maria had gone outside guidelines for me, and I will forever be grateful to her. So all she'd done, which is what anyone can do, is she documented that I was making choices that as a woman I'm entitled to make for me and my baby. But unfortunately it takes guts within the NHS to do that. So she had said to me, if you tear this time, because you had such a severe tear last time, then I'd prefer it if you went into hospital to have it stitched. And I had torn, I had 2 second-degree tears, so not as serious as that third-degree tear, but quite significant tearing. So, I mean, I didn't really care at that point. I was happy to go into the hospital. I was happy to do anything. I had my baby in my arms and I'd birthed her at home on my own. I literally, you could have asked me to do anything at that point in time and I would have done it. And so I did go in for that. So we didn't get our sort of bubble at home, and she didn't get to meet her brother before we left for the hospital, because she was born at about 1 a.m. But, beyond that, I was just absolutely on cloud 9. And I remember Maria saying to me, which was so lovely, because actually I think she had to do quite a lot of paperwork because Elsa was born before she'd arrived. They call it BBA, born before arrival. It's probably a bit of a headache for her. But she said to me, Lisa, this is absolutely the best way that it could have happened, because now you will be in no doubt that it was your body and it was you that birthed your baby. If I'd have been here, you might have thought that I contributed in some way, but now you can be absolutely sure that it was all you. And that was so lovely, and that has always stayed with me. Absolutely incredible moment. To be honest, I was on a complete crazy high after she was born. I couldn't believe how different I felt to my first birth, and actually I did far too much and I didn't rest, and I was in John Lewis picking wallpaper because we were moving house, obviously, as everyone does when they have a new baby. I was like rushing around. I wanted to be Superwoman. I remember having my in-laws around, like having them around for lunch really soon after she was born, and actually my recovery was slow. It was the toughest recovery of the three, but mentally about the birth I was just on cloud 9, and I'm still on cloud 9, and she is going to turn 8 tomorrow. And that moment was absolutely transformative for me. I really feel it's changed me as a person, and just given me so much confidence and so much awe in what my body was designed to do, not only making her, but bringing her forth. And it was just such a positive experience. And I just share a couple of reflections that I've had since then. I think one is that I am not somebody who would have chosen to birth alone. So as it turned out, it was brilliant. And actually, if I'd known that outcome, then maybe I would be someone who would have birthed alone. I'm very much a solitary birther, so I didn't want anyone around me. I would definitely not want to be massaged or touched, and I didn't want my children there. And these are all things that my thinking brain doesn't agree with, and I'm like, I want birth to be normal for my kids, but my labouring brain doesn't have people around. But I think I would have liked somebody there, just because that's a blessing to be able to have that if that's what you want. But it's on a very deep level that my trust was broken in that first birth, and I think my labouring brain just wouldn't let them be there. I think a combination of that and the fact that I was in denial that I was that I was in labour. But my third birth, which I won't talk about, I only called them for the last 4 minutes. So, again, just shows the power to me of communication and the way you're treated and how your choices are respected. And if you're clearly like quite an extreme person like me, that can have a big impact, and we need to acknowledge that. And then the thing that was really hugely beneficial for me for my third birth was I read this, it's a book now by this amazing doula called Natalie Meddings, and the book is called How to Have a Baby, and I would really recommend that you read it. But Natalie had talked to me about this concept of a first room of labour and a second room of labour, as kind of mapping out the pathway for how labour happened. And the first room of labour is when you are in labour, your body is getting ready to birth your baby. But, you're not having to do hard work at that point. And basically, only give labour the attention it deserves. So whilst you're in that first room, just distract yourself, do other things. And actually, had I done that, I could have ignored my labour right up until 2 hours before Elsa was born. And that's basically what I did for my third birth. I also had a very long early stage. My body, obviously, it likes to, think about things for a long time. I've also heard Natalie say, your body needs to release. It needs to accept that you're going to birth this baby, and if you're, I'm quite a controlling person, and I think my body needed a while for me to consent to that. So the same thing happened with my third baby, but I ignored it all, and I only honed in when I had to. When I got into that second room, serious work of labour, absolutely no choice but to really focus on it, and that meant that birth felt much shorter and compared to Elsa's birth. So that was a real learning that I did, a kind of, I don't think improvement's the right word, but a different approach that I perhaps wished I'd known about before I went into labour with my second, with Elsa. So I'll just share that with you now. But yes, I've absolutely loved telling this story again and remembering it all, and just feeling so thankful that I got that experience. But I didn't fall into it. I really had to be quite prepared, and I really had to have conviction in what I believed. And now I have confidence in my body, and I had a sort of theoretical confidence. And since Elsa's birth, I have a real tangible confidence as well, in my body's ability to birth a baby. And yeah, it was an absolutely incredible experience. So if anything's come up in this episode that you're interested in or you'd like to talk to me about, I would be delighted to do that. So all my contact information is in the notes for the podcast, and please do get in touch if you'd like to talk about anything at all. And goodbye for now. This podcast does not present itself as medical advice, and neither should it be taken as such. The views represented here are personal to the women telling their stories. Sorry for this slightly patronising disclaimer, but such is the world we live in today. Always seek out the information you need before making your own decisions.